Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to talk about Richard Rorty's paper, The World Well Lost, in which he criticizes the notion of there simply being the world. Instead, he wants to build on a lot of arguments being made by various pragmatists, as well as building on some of the implications of people like Kant, in order to discern what does it mean to talk about the world and how we occupy such a world. This is going to hinge upon a number of arguments concerning the so-called problem of intertranslatability, which is to say, it seems that we live in a world in which people come bearing different conceptual schemes. This could be things like scientific theories, language, cultural norms, whatever it may be, different schemes by which we take the world and we turn it into something coherent and understandable. And Rorty's big problem is, how do we talk about this world with others where it seems like it's impossible to do so? Now, one of the concepts that Rorty is the most critical of is the notion of the given, which is to say that there are some things which are just a priori there and given, and there are no possible worlds, so to speak, where they could be up to question. Rorty, like Putnam, which is a contemporary of his, they believe that everything is in principle possible to be doubted. Now, this doesn't mean that we should go for a Cartesian universal doubt where we say that I should start my knowledge by doubting everything and find what's impossible to doubt. No, instead, he wants to go back to a Peircean kind of understanding of doubt as being in proportion to what the world deems that we ought to doubt. And one of the things that Rorty thinks that we should doubt, because it's led to erroneous problems, is this notion of the world. He says that the notion of the world that is correlative with the notion of conceptual framework, or as I've been saying here, conceptual scheme, is simply the Kantian notion of a thing in itself. Right? When we speak of the world, we're speaking of something neutral, which is objectively the case. It is a fact of the matter. And our differences in what we claim is the case about that world merely comes from the differences in truths as articulated by our different conceptual schemes. So, for example, the natural scientist is going to say that the book is composed of atoms. The literature professor is going to say that it is constituted of a number of different meanings. The linguist is going to say it consists of phonemes and letters. Like, we have different ways of talking about the basic units of our experience. And the way that we talk about those units, Rorty is very privy to say, is inextricably linked to these conceptual schemes, but we do not have this binarism between scheme and content. Which is to say, we do not have the given world, which is unperturbed, and then the perturbation of our conceptual scheme. Instead, these are, as Heidegger would say, equiprimordial with one another, and they both require the postulation of one another at the same time. One cannot come before the other. We can't imagine, for example, a conceptual scheme without something which our scheme is talking about. But also, we can't imagine this world irrespective of the way in which we articulate and comport ourselves towards it and talk about it and so forth. So he wants to bring us back to Quine. And Quine is very critical of the distinction between analytic and synthetic, which is to say between the a priori and the a posteriori. This is also known as Hume's fork, where we have two different ways of knowing things or talking about things. We have relations of ideas and matters of fact. And relations of ideas are those things which require us not to comport our cognition towards any empirical content. These would be statements like, there are no married bachelors, or a triangle has three sides. I don't need to be pointing to anything in my experience to know that. It's just true definitionally, or a priori. Based on the ways in which we use these concepts and the relations that they have to one another, it's just a case that these ideas have certain relations to each other such that there could be no other way for them to be than as such. Now, matters of fact are different because I can say, for example, this book has such and such amount of pages. And that requires that I'm talking about a specific book in my experience, which either is or is not in accordance with that statement. And these two different things, Hume likes to claim, and Kant after him as well, are categorically different, and there's no spillage between them, so to speak. A statement is either entirely analytic or entirely synthetic, which is to say it's either a case of just analyzing matters of fact of definitions or matters of fact of empirical phenomena in the world. And these two are qualitatively different from one another. But Quine is very critical of this, and Rorty says Quine's suggestion that the difference between a priori and empirical truth is merely that between the relatively difficult to give up and the relatively easy brings in its train the notion that there is no clear distinction to be drawn between questions of meaning and questions of fact. So Quine is going to point out that really, when we talk about the a priori versus the a posteriori, or the analytic versus the synthetic, really we're talking about a spectrum in which certain things seem more difficult to give up and certain things more easy to give up. This can be, for example, because Quine thinks of our knowledge as something like a solar system kind of model, where we have points more towards the center, which are more central to our notions of what we hold as true. And then as we move outwards towards the peripheries, these are things which are more subject to doubt. They are, for example, bear upon experience more directly, and our scheme is kind of limited. It is kind of circumambulated by experience. And experience is that thing which our conceptual scheme must bear against. But he says that, we can't have one of these without the other, the conceptual scheme without the content, and the content without the conceptual scheme. And when we have any theoretical apparatus, anything in principle is possible to doubt. None of these are a priori. It's just the case that certain things such as 2 + 2 = 4, or things like the nature of time, they seem so central to the way that we govern and interact with the world and tarry with our future prospects that we can't imagine them being any other way. But Quine is very critical of this, and Rorty wants to extract from this the notion that while there does seem to be some difference between questions of meaning and fact, these blend seamlessly into one another, such that we cannot draw a clear distinction between the two, that our discussions of fact are irrevocably tied to ones of value. And that as such, we have to give up notions of the given and the a priori. And this leads us to a very interesting conception of the world, and one that Rorty really wants to bring to the fore, which is that the world is really one of these things that seems more analytic. It's one of those things that we seem not to be able to do without. This notion that the world is something unitary, self-sufficient, given, which merely is present, and we represent it or we represent it in our conceptual schemes, and we filter it through different things. And sure, we kind of come up with differences, but we think, okay, some of them are close enough that, for example, if I call it world and the German calls it Welt, then we can still talk to each other. We have some common experiences, some common ways of using world and Welt in sentences that we can figure things out. But what happens if these things are so different we seem not to be able to talk with each other? Well, Rorty really wants to bring to the fore a Peircean notion, which is that of funded experience. That is, those beliefs which are not at the moment being challenged because they present no problems and no one has bothered to think of alternatives to them. And as such, funded experience is the equivalence of what Peirce calls belief, which is just to say an unperturbed state of mind where we uncritically go about the world. But maybe we run into something where I have a belief and suddenly experience requires that I call that belief into question. Thus, we have arising doubt. And doubt is an uncomfortable state of cognitive dissonance where certain beliefs are not in accordance with experience. What do I do if I say all pens are blue or black and then I have a purple pen? Well, I have to alter my beliefs. And of course, this is a very mundane example, but maybe this is a political or religious example, and you have something that severely calls your previous beliefs into question. Well, you must enter the state of actively figuring out new things and actively tarrying. And there's always doubt, even in the beliefs that seem the most true. It's just they're not brought to the fore because it's not seriously in question. We might have little things that make us kind of think twice, but then we go, okay, that's fine. So when we talk about funded experience, Rorty wants to use this to think about how do we talk about the world? And he says that the world is really an obsession rather than an intuition. It's something that we desperately want to desire that our knowledge stands upon some firm foundation. But considering this notion of funded experience and that anything could be brought into doubt, at least in principle, provided that experience required us to do that, he says the world is just whatever that vast majority of our beliefs not currently in question are currently thought to be about. So this is the sort of latent background that we feel comfortable standing upon in our daily experience. It's enough for us, in other words. And this is how the world usually is. The world consists of tables and chairs and books and pens, and none of these are really things that I think I need to call into doubt. But anyone who has had a significant intellectual challenge in their life knows that when these things are called into doubt, suddenly the ground seems to shake. And Rorty wants to claim that there are two possibilities for what we can make of this concept, the world. He says, I want to claim that the world is either the purely vacuous notion of the ineffable cause of sense and the goal of intellect, or else a name for the objects that inquiry at the moment is leaving alone. Those planks in the boat which are at the moment not being moved about. And Rorty's perfectly satisfied with the second explanation, because if you can't have figured it out thus far, he's more privy to the latter. That whenever we're at sea, our boat is always being, perturbed by the waves, and our planks are weathering and eroding and constantly in need of repairs and whatnot. And this is fine. This is how we interact with the world. Experience is constantly making us ever so slightly change our beliefs. And as such, changing these planks is perfectly fine. In fact, it shows the way in which experience butts up against our conceptual schemes, which is to say it doesn't just butt up against them ever so slightly. We don't just have our conceptual scheme over here and every once in a while experience goes, doot, doot, oh, we need to change something. No, they're completely constantly intermeshed with each other, such that every day, for example, your purpose in life is being called into question by various experiences of, is this worth it? Or shall I go on? These kind of moody, or at least seemingly moody questions. As such, Rorty wants us to reconceptualize the world in the mindset of the Deweyan point of funded experience as the cash value of the notion of the world. In other words, that every belief pays off in some way. It, as James says, there can be no difference which does not make a difference. So any belief which is not erroneous will have some sort of cash value in our experience. And this is not a utilitarian point of we ought to treat things as if they have cash value, or we ought to incline ourselves towards those beliefs which have a cash value. No, ultimately, Rorty is going to say, I have no objective justification for why you ought to tailor your beliefs towards those which have the most cash value, which pay off the most, in thinking about how you orient yourselves towards the future. Ultimately, if you just want to sit in your bed and say that, life has no meaning, nothing does anything for me, people are pointless, that's your prerogative. But Dewey's going to say that if you desire to move towards the future, and in fact, that is what life and being itself does, is it throws itself in front of itself and is constantly chasing itself, trying to establish itself in this world, then what one must do is let experience fund one's beliefs. And thus, we move towards what he calls a naturalized view of historicism. He says, in this historicist vision, the arts, the sciences, the sense of right and wrong, and the institutions of society are not attempts to embody or formulate truth or goodness or beauty. In other words, as Dewey would say, most of the things that we do in our lives are not knowledge affairs whatsoever. For example, when we're knowing water, really, we're not knowing it at all. We're reacting to it, we're drowning in it, we're drinking it, we're filling it up, we're finding it, and none of these are knowledge affairs in the formal sense of the word. We're not trying to cognize something or represent something, we're merely acting. They are attempts to solve problems, to modify our beliefs and desires and activities in ways that will bring us greater happiness than we have now. I want to suggest that this shift in perspective is the natural consequence of dropping the receptivity/spontaneity and intuition/concept distinctions, and more generally of dropping the notion of representation and the view of man that Dewey has called the spectator theory and Heidegger the identification of physis and idea. In other words, we're no longer concerned with representing some world, but rather acting in a way in which we are immersed in a common world in which we cannot irrevocably disentangle fact from value, meaning from the content of the world from which we gain those meanings. And this is one of the key ways in which pragmatists, and in particular the so-called neo-pragmatists, will talk about philosophy and its problems. That being said, I hope that this has been helpful. Just wanted to give some short thoughts from this essay because I think it's a very important one. Consider checking out any of my other stuff I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs and is held once a month. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate directly to the channel, because as a poor college student, I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure whatsoever. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.